Morning.
Morning. Morning.
Yeah, today is July 12th, 2026, and tentative title for my talk is Right Brain, Left Brain. Going to be talking about an author, psychiatrist and scientist named Iain McGilchrist, who wrote a book entitled The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. I think he wrote it in 2009. And 10 years later, he was featured on the podcast Hidden Brain. Their title was One Head, Two Brains. And that came out in 2019. So I'm gonna pick my way through the transcript, but before we start doing that, I thought I'd sort of lay a few things out. First about him, this Iain McGilchrist. He's British, nothing wrong with that. And he was an English major. He was studying English. And he said to Shankar Vedantam, the host of Hidden Brain, said, "I used to work in the area of English literature. And in brief," of course he says this with an English accent, which I'm not going to attempt, "and in brief, I left it partly because I loved poetry too much. And it seemed to me that these internally implicit, unique, embodied creatures, the poems, were being turned into explicit, general, and entirely abstract entities. So I thought this was a destructive process. I wrote a book called Against Criticism and went off to study medicine and become a psychiatrist." And Shankar asked him, so this would be like, give me the 600-word summary of Macbeth? And McGilchrist said, yeah, that's it. Or here are 6 points you need to know about Jane Austen. And they are, whatever it is, And being able to translate a poem, reduce it to some incredibly banal ideas that you could have found somewhere else. Yeah. What he's saying is, analysis is the wrong tool to appreciate poetry, to appreciate music, to appreciate life. It's useful. Analysis is useful, but it's the wrong tool in a lot of places. Explaining a poem takes the life out of it. My love got old and died, and it's very sad. Doesn't make much of a poem. Or even worse, explaining a joke. I have to do this often because I usually send my jokes sailing over people's heads. It's always a bad scene. It's really interesting that this struck him, so deeply that he actually changed his major and realized, no, I don't want to go down this path. I remember a similar feeling when I was in college and I was taking English Lit. Maybe it was American. Anyway, we were reading Huck Finn. And I went in and talked to my teacher, who was kind of a wonderful teacher and also very tough. Gave me a D on a paper at one point. Said, you write gracefully and with wit and say nothing new at all. And it was a paper where I was supposed to analyze a short story and try to come up with some new way to analyze it. Anyway, I went in and I remember talking to him about there's a scene in Huckleberry Finn where Huck and Jim, the slave that he's helping to escape and reunite with his family in New Orleans, Huck and Jim are floating down the Mississippi River in a raft. And Mark Twain, of course, writing in Huck's voice, just waxes eloquent about what it's like on the river mist rising behind the trees and sounds and just the whole feel. It's just a beautiful passage. And I asked my teacher, what can you say about that? Just there it is. And he said, yeah, you can't really say anything about it. Because when you do, it just dries up. Anytime you step outside of an experience and objectify it, you've made it smaller. It's easier to deal with, easier to feed into your AI engine or whatever you want to do, but it's dead. And we're going to talk about that. Ian McGilchrist talks about that quite a bit because in his considered opinion, it's the real big problem with what we call the Western world, which is really at this point the whole world. So the title of his book, again, The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. And the title of the book comes from a parable. It's a myth about a wise spiritual master who rules over some land, some country. And the master has an emissary, and he's a smart messenger. His job is to carry the master's instructions to the far corners of the land. And this is McGilchrist speaking here. He says, this emissary was bright enough, but not quite bright enough, to know what it was he didn't know. And he thought, I know everything. And he thought, what does the master know sitting back there, seraphically smiling, or angelically smiling? Well, I do all the hard work. And so he adopted the master's cloak, pretending to be the master. And because he didn't know what he didn't know, the result was that the community fell apart. You can see where we're going here. So I'm going to turn to the transcript with that as a sort of introduction. And just pick out a few of the things that I thought were really either interesting or useful. Yeah. And of course, my definition of interesting may be different from yours. I do tend to geek out a bit on science of the human body and the human mind. So McGilchrist says, talking about this whole area of left brain, right brain, which of course we've all heard about, I'm sure, and it's a big item in popular culture. You can see lots of things on YouTube, and it's pretty, a lot of it is misguided and incorrect and too general. And he says, I was told when I got involved in this area, that's as he turned to science, don't touch it. It's toxic. Don't even go there. You know the stuff, men are left-brained, women are right-brained. Everybody has one side of the brain that they lean to. Yeah, there's a lot of just sound bites and generalizations that don't really help that much. And I think what McGilchrist has done is actually, I find it pretty helpful. Vedantam introduces him and says, Ian McGilchrist is a psychiatrist. He spent years studying the human brain, and through studies of his patients and a detailed examination of scientific research, he's found himself fascinated by a question that has intrigued philosophers and scientists for centuries. Why is the human brain divided at all? And McGilchrist says, in motor terms, it's pretty straightforward. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, gets messages from it, and vice versa. But in terms of psychological life, they're quite different kinds of roles. They have quite different dispositions. And I believe that evolutionarily, they are addressing different questions. Says the conventional model that sprang up probably in the 60s and the 70s and has had some life into the 80s and even into the 90s and is now probably mainly at home in middle management programs and pop psychology books. I was told when I got involved, don't touch it, it's toxic, don't even go there. And basically, that was that the left hemisphere is logical and verbal, and the right hemisphere is kind of moody and possibly creative. But of course, all this turns out to be much more complicated, and some of it is just wrong. There are things that the left hemisphere does that the right hemisphere can't do. One of them is language. If you have a left hemisphere stroke, for instance, you may lose the ability to speak. So, starting with the original question, why is the brain split? McGilchrist says this isn't something that was invented by human beings. It's there in all mammals, amphibians, reptiles, fish, insects, nematode worms, which one of them has 302 neurons, but it's working asymmetrically. And in fact, the oldest creatures that we know of that have any kind of neural net are called Nematostella vectensis, 700 million years old, and thought of as the origin of neural networks. And there too, the network is asymmetrical. You have a left and a right. So Vedantam asks, Shankar asks, why would you have the brain be divided? It does beg the question. And McGilchrist says, yes, especially if you buy, which I emphatically don't, the idea that the brain is a computer, because it would be a vast waste of computing power to have the brain divided into 2 bits. Why would you do that? And he talks about the way that you see charts of the brain divided up into what the various areas do. This part does this, that part does that. But if you used a different model, not a machine model, but a model that this is part of a human being, you might ask a different question, which is not what does it do, but how does it do it? And that turns out to be a profoundly important question when looking at the hemispheres, because they are both involved in doing everything. But there's a difference. And it's that quite consistently, each hemisphere does all these things in a totally different way, with a different kind of spirit towards a different end. And then, just to summarize it, Shankar steps in. One of the hemispheres, the right, focuses on the big picture. The left focuses on details. Both are essential, but if you can't see the big picture, you don't understand what you're doing. If you can't home in on the details, you can't accomplish the simplest task. The fundamental difference in orientation turns out to have profound consequences for everything the 2 hemispheres do. And then they give the example of a piece of music. So imagine you're attracted to a piece of music and you try playing it as a whole and you love it, but you realize there are bits where you're not quite getting it right. And say you know that you need to practice your fingering at bar 18. And when you take it apart, you realize, oh, here we move into the subdominant. At this point, we're moving back into the dominant. You understand a whole lot of details, which are fine. You need to do the work, and you need to do the analysis. But when you come to play the piece, you have to put all of that out of your mind. Otherwise, you won't be able to play at all. So he summarizes, the right hemisphere takes in the whole at the start. The left hemisphere unpacks that, enriches it. But when that work is done, it needs to be taken back into the whole picture, which only the right hemisphere can do. And of course, it's not just with music. Shankar gives the example, brings up the example of just a bird trying to pick up a piece of corn. And McGilchrist says, all living creatures need to be able to attend to the world in two different ways, which require quite different attention at the same time. And this is not possible unless they can work relatively independently. On the one hand, in order to manipulate the world, to get food, to pick up a twig, to build a nest, you need a very precise, targeted attention on a detail in order to be able to achieve that and get ahead of your competition. But if you're only doing that, if you're a bird just concentrating on that little seed, you'll quickly become somebody else's lunch while you're getting your own, because you need at the same time to be paying the precise opposite kind of attention, not piecemeal, fragmented, and detailed, but sustained, broad, and vigilant for predators and for other members of your species. This really, of course, has echoes in practice, in Zazen. We have one-pointed attention, it's essential, but there's also that broad awareness. If you don't have some sort of broad awareness, you may find yourself getting into samadhi, but you also find yourself getting completely lost in thoughts, unaware even of what you're doing. We need both. It's the skill of a long-term meditator that both of those are developed. Of course, takes a long time. You see this kind of awareness in what we call prey animals, deer or gazelles, antelope. And I read something once about what goes on there when a predator comes along. So this is my friend Robert Sapolsky writing one of his many books about stress. So when a prey animal is chased, it has all the stress reactions that we carry around with us all day long. His heart starts pounding, there's all kinds of stress hormones released, cortisol is flowing through the bloodstream, and it's able to run very fast. And there's adrenaline going on, everything. But the interesting thing is, when researchers check that, let's say it's a gazelle, check it out after it's safe again, it's made its way to safety, almost immediately all that drops away. All the stress is gone. Whereas with you and me, we're going to be talking about PTSD, right? We're going to carry that around for a long, long time. And the reason is, of course, because we think about it. We make it into a thing. That's what we do. The writer and also a brain scientist, I believe, Jill Bolte Taylor, who wrote a book, something like My Stroke of Insight, some other word, My Something of Insight, who had a left hemisphere stroke, pointed out that any time you have a stress reaction, it's got a shelf life of about 90 seconds. That's how long that cascade maintains itself, and then it'll just die away. But of course, for many people, that doesn't happen because we want to go back out and worry it and replay it and wonder how it could have happened. I remember reading something about people who become air traffic controllers. It's considered the most stressful job there is, and no matter how good the air traffic controller is, if you check out their vitals while they're on the job, they are stressed out. But there are two kinds of people, and some of them, when the job is over and they go home, boom, it's gone. They just move on to the next thing. And others, that level of arousal continues for a long time. It affects their sleep, affects their life, and at least half the people who begin as air traffic controllers have to quit. They just drop out. But I digress. Just noticed that. They look a little bit at the, people have probably heard this term, the corpus callosum. That's the bundle of fibers that's right in the middle of the brain between the left and right lobes, and that communicates from one to the other. So you get the right brain gets feedback from the left, and the left gets feedback from the right. And a lot of what they've learned about the ways these hemispheres work is by examining people who, because of a neurological condition, a seizure disorder, let's say, have had that severed, a really radical surgery where you truly do have a split brain. They can't even talk to each other. And a lot we learn from people can still function. It's pretty amazing. But there are some deficits for sure. But the two halves are doing two different jobs. He says, he makes the point, if a surgeon collaborates with a scrub nurse, they both don't try to do the same job. They have distinct roles. And by having the connection only be through the corpus callosum, you can have that separation with a certain amount of connection. In fact, McGilchrist points out that when people first were looking at these patients, they thought there were two distinct people there and that they would talk to one another. And these are, he says, these very famous names in the history of neurology, neuropsychology. They would talk about the two hemispheres as two people. I don't know exactly who those people are, but anytime you look back into the history of science, it's astounding what we didn't know. You go back even 20 years, and if you go back 100 years or whatever, it's astounding. It took so long to discover how infections spread, for surgeons to admit they needed to wash their hands before they moved from helping a woman give birth to doing surgery on another patient. It's a very slow process for human beings to wake up, and it applies to science as well as everything else. Shankar says, Ian's book has a lot of science in it, but it's also a commentary on modern industrial societies. The title of the book comes from a parable, a myth about a wise spiritual master who rules over a land. Okay, we've heard this already. He's a smart messenger, and his job is to carry the instructions to the far corners of the land. And McGilchrist said, he's bright enough but not quite bright enough to know what it was he didn't know. And he thought, I know everything. And he thought, what does the master know sitting back there? And I do all the work. Ian argues that the right hemisphere of the brain is supposed to play the role of the wise master of our mental kingdom, and the left is supposed to be the emissary. And we have grown infatuated, McGilchrist says, with the skills of the emissary. We prize the details and we scorn the big picture. The big picture is too woo-woo, too touchy-feely, too diffuse. Says, your left hemisphere is busy processing things to make sure they're consistent and unpacked, but your right hemisphere is seeing everything. I'm suggesting that we have arrived at a place, not for the first time in the West, where we slipped into only listening to what it is that the left hemisphere can tell us and discounting what the right hemisphere could have told us. You see it in the sort of hard-charging spirit of Western business, Western government. Identify problems and solve them. You know, you got too many rabbits, well, kill all the rabbits. That didn't work, do something differently. It's just getting in there, identifying, labeling something as a problem, and then removing it, and hoping somehow we can find our way to a stable system. But of course, what you have is destroyed pasture lands, destroyed people, an epidemic of depression and anxiety, because we have our heads buried in the details, because we only want to look at what we can measure. If you can't measure it, what good is it? It's amazing how in business you try to get better results from your workers by finding some aspect of their job that you can measure, and then you give rewards for people who do that. And inevitably it warps what they do and it backfires. So much horrific stuff happening now that we can monitor workers more closely. You have delivery people driving around with a pee pot so they won't have to waste any time stopping and going to the bathroom because they're being tracked. It's kind of grim, really. But everything we do that's complicated requires that big picture. It requires that we have situational awareness, that we can relax out of our insistence on just doing something, on manipulating something. There's so much that we discover when we're not busy tearing it apart, when we've balanced analysis with the big picture. One point, Shankar asks, do the hemispheres differ in how they think about time, their orientation toward the future and their orientation toward the past? And McGilchrist says, interesting question, and not in a clear-cut way, although the left hemisphere is tending to look for the next opportunity. So it's very goal-driven, but very short-term goal-driven. It wants to grasp things that are within reach. The left hemisphere controls our right hand, with which we grasp things that are within reach. So it has a very direct, linear idea of a target, and let's go get it. Time can be seen rather like the flow of a river, which isn't made up of slices or chunks of river that are put together. Time is not a sequence of seconds. It's indivisible. It's a flow. And he says, we as personalities, as people in time, or cultures in time, are like this flow. And the left hemisphere can't deal with anything that's moving. It fixes things. It likes things to be fixed because then you can grab them. You can't grasp your prey, you can't pick up something unless you at least immobilize it for that second while you're interacting with it. It's something that plays out in breath practice. You know, we say we're suggesting counting on the out-breath. So on your out-breath, you think, wow. Then you breathe in. Next breath, 2. But the danger there is you think, here's a breath, and here's a breath, and here's a breath, and this one's in, and this one's out. It's just a rhythm. It's a flow. When you really get into your practice, it's so enjoyable. It's a rhythm. There's a gestalt. It's an overall feeling. It can be quite remarkable when all the labels and the chunks and the thoughts disappear into one. You know, there's a line in the Affirming Faith in Mind, the chant we do, written supposedly by the third patriarch. Just calmly see that all is one, and by themselves false thoughts will go. To see that all is one is to step away from dividing things up. Stepping away from names, from opinions, from all the useful things that the left brain does. It's stepping into what we don't really know. Roshi Kapleau used to say, to go I know not where, by a road I know not of. Bodhin Roshi used to say the 3 most famous words in Zen are Bodhidharma's, I don't know. It's a surrender. I've said a lot of times, if to a person with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. For those of us with active, analytic minds, it's just second nature to strip everything down to these imaginary details, because there are no separate pieces. The universe comes as one. You can't see it through analysis. I can't tell you, I can't tell myself, and therefore see it. We have to be quiet. We have to abandon the emissary for a while. See what the master is smiling about. It's interesting that so many of the amazing discoveries in science, which of course is an analytic endeavor, have come at times when all the analysis drops away and there's a sudden flash of insight, what we call an aha experience. Give you a couple examples. Archimedes, many people know this story. He's the Greek who was given the problem of how to determine whether a crown was pure gold. So he was able to weigh it. Then he just needed to know how large it was, measure its volume, so that he could see if by volume it was gold or maybe it was lead or some other metal. And he noticed when he stepped into the bath, after dwelling on this problem and trying this and trying that, he realized that the water level rose in exact proportion to the volume of his submerged body. And that gave him a way to measure by displacement the density of the crown. At the time, he cried out a word in Greek, Eureka, which means I've got it, I've found it. Supposedly, Newton discovered his theory of gravity seeing an apple fall. Some people claim it fell on his head. I don't think that was what happened. But anyway, an apple fell and all of a sudden he made the connection. It's another chemist who was trying to figure out the structure of the benzene molecule. It's an organic molecule, quite complicated. And the answer came to him when he was half asleep in a sort of daydream. He saw a snake biting its own tail. And then he realized suddenly that the molecule was a circle. The carbon atoms formed a closed ring. So many things that come delivered from a part of our mind that we can't access, that sees connections. And of course, the stories we hear in Zen of people coming to some sort of insight. It happens when they're not expecting it. They're absorbed, but they're not thinking. And they're not grasping. There needs to be an openness that we can cultivate, we can value. An openness that we can practice letting go. First thing we let go of course, is our thoughts. Most people in this world are just hopping from thought to thought to thought and blindly reacting to whatever pops into their mind. We imagine that there are thoughts, but nobody can predict their next thought. Go ahead and try. One of the big things that Iain McGilchrist brings out in his book is how unhappy the situation of modern society is. It seems like it's accelerating. But it's not necessary. You don't have to buy into the dominant paradigm. You don't have to measure yourself by the standards of society. I want to read a familiar passage from Anthony DeMello. So buckle up. He says, a small-time businessman, 55 years old, sipping a beer at a bar. And he's saying, well, look at my classmates. They all made it. DeMello says, the idiot. What does he mean they made it? They got their names in the newspaper. Do you call that making it? One is president of the corporation. The other has become the chief justice. Somebody else has become this or that. Monkeys, all of them. Who determines what it means to be a success? This stupid society. The main preoccupation of society is to keep society sick. And the sooner you realize that, the better. Sick, every one of them. They're loony, they're crazy. You became president of the lunatic asylum, and you're proud of it, even though it means nothing. Being president of a corporation has nothing to do with being a success in life. Having a lot of money, nothing to do. You're a success in life when you wake up. Then you don't have to apologize to anyone. You don't have to explain anything to anyone. You don't give a damn what anybody thinks about you or what anybody says about you. You have no worries. You're happy. That's what I call being a success. These are unhappy people. They're miserable people. They don't enjoy life. They're constantly tense and anxious. Do you call that human? And you know why that happens? Only one reason. They identified with some label, with their money or their job or their profession, or their likes on Instagram. It's dismaying how much time is put into presenting a good face to the rest of the world. And now that we have iPhones and computers, that audience can be so large. And of course, it's also very cruel. There's an awful lot of damage done. It's so wonderful to have friends and meet people who are not fully immersed in that stream, who aren't judging you or anybody else by the size of their car or how clean their house is or any other of the arbitrary measurements of worth. There is something far more important and far less measurable. And most people who have taken up any kind of spiritual practice know that on a deep level. Doesn't matter if you give a good talk or a bad talk, right? I was thinking when I was preparing this talk, I had another idea, which was to give a talk on procrastination. And I would begin it by saying my talk is on procrastination. We'll now stop and recite the 4 vows. So, our time is up. We'll now stop and recite the 4 vows.